Samuel's spare shirt, his blanket, and that wooden bowl of his were still there, things no runaway would ever think to leave behind. It was almost as if the man had simply melted into the trees. Crenshaw had dogs brought up from Charleston. Patrols scarred the pine stands, the marsh reeds, the murky swamp water. The marshal questioned every enslaved person in the camp, watching for any flicker of fear that might give the truth away. But the answer was always the same. Samuel had been there, and then he wasn't. Nobody saw him go. Nobody claimed to know where he'd disappeared to. Nobody offered even a single clue. The marshal wasn't ready to quit. He stationed men at every road, every ferry landing, every bridge, creek, and inlet. He sent word to sheriffs all across Georgia and South Carolina. He put up a reward so large that enslaved people could have bought their freedom by handing Samuel over. Not a single person came forward. Not one voice broke that heavy silence. Not one enslaved man or woman gave Samuel up. The search dragged on for weeks. Crenshaw followed every rumor, every supposed sighting, every faint whisper, and every time, he arrived just a step behind. Samuel had become something more than a man. He was a shadow drifting through the low country, slipping through every gap in the landscape. And then, on October the 3rd, 1845, they found the marshal's own body. He was discovered at the bottom of a ravine near the Altamaha River. His neck was broken. His rifle lay beside him, never fired. His horse stood calmly a quarter-mile away. The local authorities ruled that he'd fallen while tracking someone across rough ground. The report marked it an accidental death. But the men who knew what his investigation had really been about understood the truth. The river ghost had struck again. He had watched the one man who might have caught him, and he'd removed him from the board with that same cold precision he'd used on overseers, planters, catchers, and sheriffs. After Crenshaw's death, the investigation fell apart. Nobody volunteered to step into a dead marshal's shoes. Plantation owners buried the reports. Newspapers stayed quiet. And the killings, like the tide, kept their slow, steady rise. By the late 1840s, fear along the coastal plantations was no longer just a murmur. It had become a sickness. Overseers wouldn't work alone anymore. Slave catchers demanded higher pay or quit outright. Some planters sold off their entire estates and fled north. The legend of the river ghost grew stronger than any law, any patrol, any pistol a white man could carry. And Samuel, if that was still his name, had become the most hunted man in the South. A man nobody could catch. A man nobody would betray. A man who moved like water through the swamps and killed like darkness itself. By the late 1840s, the low country had settled into a quiet panic. Plantation owners no longer spoke openly about the deaths. Doing so only made them feel more powerless. Overseers carried pistols on both hips. Slave catchers traveled in groups rather than alone. Even the most arrogant planters started avoiding the marsh paths after dark. Yet for all their caution, the killings went on with that same cold patience as before. Always near water, always without witnesses, always impossible to explain. Samuel, sold and resold across Georgia and South Carolina, left behind a trail that no official dared to name. Each sale was meant to contain him. Each new plantation owner believed they could control him. Each thought cruelty or caution or strict discipline would keep him in line. And every time, after weeks or months of silence, the pattern returned like the rising tide. Overseers vanished. Slave catchers never came back from patrol. Men known for brutality were found dead in ditches, ponds, canals, and creeks, drowned in water so shallow it could barely wet a man's boots. For enslaved people, these deaths weren't tragedies, they were messages. Proof that the system could bleed. Proof that the river could swallow down those who had spent their lives drowning others. They never spoke Samuel's name to whites, but at night in the quarters they whispered stories about him. Half man, half shadow. Someone who moved silently through the cane fields. Someone who slipped beneath the water and rose up behind men who thought they were untouchable. A symbol of vengeance, a myth with a pulse by 1850. The river ghost wasn't just a tale anymore, it was an epidemic. And the white men who depended on fear to keep order were suddenly learning what it felt like to fear the dark themselves. Some plantations couldn't hold on to overseers. Slave catchers demanded 3 times their usual rates. A handful of owners, those who understood just how much the killings were costing them, sold everything and fled to Charleston or Savannah, abandoning the land rather than risk becoming the next corpse pulled from a canal. Still, no one dared speak the truth out loud. One enslaved man was dismantling the slave system from the inside. Then in 1860, the world beyond the plantations caught fire. The country fractured along the line between slavery and freedom. Political arguments turned into threats, then into violence. The South pushed toward secession, convinced that its entire way of life was under attack. While newspapers shouted about abolitionists and tariffs, the marshes kept their own quiet war. One man hunting the very people who claimed to own him. On April 12, 1861, when Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter, everything changed overnight. Planters rushed to join the war, overseers enlisted, slave patrols dissolved as their men rode off to fight for the Confederacy. The entire system that had kept enslaved people under constant surveillance suddenly cracked wide open. For 4 brutal years, the American Civil War tore across the nation. But in the swamps of Georgia and the rice fields of South Carolina, another conflict continued beneath the surface. With patrols gone and fewer eyes watching, Samuel became even harder to track. Confederate soldiers posted along supply lines near the rivers started turning up dead. Pickets vanished. Couriers were found drowned. Men sent to guard bridges or maintain water routes simply failed to return. In 1863, a Confederate colonel named Marcus Talbot wrote a letter, now preserved in the National Archives, complaining that one Negro had been killing his men for months. His soldiers called the killer the River Ghost. They begged not to stand night watch near the creeks. Some believed the man had been killing white men for decades. Talbot requested permission to pull soldiers from the front lines to hunt him. His superiors denied it. The Confederacy was losing the war. They couldn't spare a single rifle for a ghost. And so the killings continued, hidden beneath the thunder of cannons and the marching of armies. Even in the middle of a civil war, one man continued his personal campaign, silent, methodical, unrelenting. He killed overseers when he could find them, slave catchers when he crossed their paths, Confederate soldiers when they ventured too close to the rivers he knew so well. By the time the war ended in 1865, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox and the broken Confederacy collapsed, the deaths attributed to the River Ghost had surpassed 200. And still, no one had ever caught him. No one had ever seen him clearly. No one, not one enslaved person, had ever betrayed him. The war freed millions, but it erased the paper trail that had followed Samuel's movements. No more bills of sale, no more plantation ledgers, no more overseers reporting accidents. With slavery gone, Samuel vanished into the chaos of Reconstruction. His trail went cold. The River Ghost faded back into myth, a whisper shared between the descendants of those who survived bondage. But the story wasn't finished. Not yet, because somewhere years later, in a quiet freedman settlement, an old man appeared who knew far too much, and some people believed the ghost had come home one last time. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the South collapsed into a kind of stunned silence. Plantations lay abandoned. Families were scattered. Freedmen roamed the countryside searching for wives, husbands, and children sold away long ago, and in that great migration, thousands moving, thousands hiding, thousands trying to rebuild a life that had never been theirs. Samuel's trail vanished. The killing stopped. The newspapers never mentioned the River Ghost again. White society convinced itself it had been a rumor, an exaggeration, a superstition born out of wartime fear. But in the Gullah communities of the Low Country, those isolated, tight-knit enclaves along the coast, people continued to whisper, not loudly, never publicly, but around fire pits, on porches at dusk, in the soft cadence of Gullah tongue. The story survived. They believed he lived. They believed he had slipped into the swamps where white men did not follow. They believed he was waiting for the world to change enough that he could die in peace. Those whispers gained new life in the summer of 1877, 12 years after the war. In a small settlement near Beaufort, South Carolina, a stranger arrived on foot. It was one of dozens of freedmen villages carved out of broken plantation land. 40 or so families farming tiny plots, fishing the creeks, trying to survive Reconstruction's hunger and violence. The man was old. Older than most men who had lived through slavery. His back was bent, his hair white, his hands knotted with scars that looked like rope, fire, and iron. He carried nothing but a small bundle containing a blanket and a wooden bowl. He did not give a name. When someone finally asked what they should call him, he replied quietly, "Call me whatever suits you. The name don't mean much anymore." He moved into an abandoned cabin on the edge of the settlement. Within a week he had repaired the roof, patched the walls and cleared a small garden